it'll process, and then you can upload.
Okay, sounds good. Alrighty, so hello everyone. Recording's been started. So welcome to the Thursday night session of Delta Platoon. I'm Omar. I'll be your Thursday night instructor. We will start on Thursdays 15 minutes late because I have a prior engagement right before this. So Thursdays will go from just about 5:45 Central until I guess that'll be 9:45 Central. So today we're just going to discuss a little bit and review some of the material from yesterday, since I know the Git material can sometimes be a lot. We're going to go over the Git pair challenge. And then after that, we'll jump into the new stuff for today with JavaScript, play around with some pseudocode, and then do a couple of exercises. So before I jump into things, did anybody have any questions about the material from yesterday or the day before, or anything at all that we can get started by answering before we move into Git stuff?
I did, but I think it will be answered as we go through the challenge from yesterday. I mainly just had some syntax questions about like merge, or if you necessarily need to do anything after git push. So I think if we go through it today, I think I'll understand it. Okay,
sounds good. And yeah, to be completely honest, whenever I do anything with Git commands in the console, I 99% of the time will have the official Git documentation up on the side, just to make sure that I don't make any weird mistakes whenever going through it, because it is really easy to have a couple of small syntax errors, and then this may or may not have happened to me before, but you end up uploading your entire computer onto GitHub, which is not very fun, and it's really easy to do. And that is something that we want to avoid. So hopefully, after discussing how not to do that today, none of you guys will make that mistake. All right, so let's jump into things. Let me just pop open my window here. Come on. Nope. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm just going to go through some really simple, just how-to stuff for Git and the command line. So I'm going to pop this link in the main Delta channel. And this is what we're going to start our day off with, just discussing Git and how it works. So let's see if I can share my screen. Awesome. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see this okay. If not, let me know. I've got my chat notifications up. Also, one other thing to note is that I am using Windows. So I know we've got a lot of folks using Mac and Linux here. There hopefully shouldn't be too many differences in terms of syntax and commands. Most of them are the exact same. But if there are, I will encourage you guys to perhaps discuss with some of the more Mac or Linux first instructors on what to do for your particular machine. But again, most of it is going to be exactly the same, since now we're done with the slight mess that is the install process. So the first thing that we're going to do in order to use Git is open up our command prompt or command line or terminal. So for me, it's just CMD. And you just open up whatever version of shell or PowerShell that you guys have. For the Mac folks, it's terminal. For us, it's just built-in command line. So the first thing that we want to do is make sure that Git is installed. And again, feel free to go through this on your own as well, because I'm just going to walk through some of the basic commands here. And we can just type either Git or Git version. So if you type in Git, which is usually what I like to do, it'll just show you a bunch of stuff that talks about how to use Git, and all of the different commands that you can use, like cloning and init and whatnot, which is great. And also, if you ever have questions about a specific command, like for example, Matthew mentioned that he has some questions about the merge command. Well, the really nice thing about terminal or command prompt is that for a large library like Git, it has a built-in help feature. And to use that, we literally just type the name of the library, which is Git. And then if we look where I'm highlighting over here, we literally just say Git help and then the name of the command. So here, let's say if you have a question about the merge syntax and you don't want to merge anything right now, just hit Git help merge and wait. And then a nice little page up here shows up that shows you how to do this, what proper syntax exists for merge, what it does. It has a couple of not so great graphics, but they show roughly what it does. So that's some tool that can be pretty helpful. Okay, so moving on from that, did everybody get a chance to go through and configure Git and the GitHub CLI on your computers yesterday or through install?
I wasn't able to because I had to miss that class.
Okay, so here, let me just jot down a note. So I will go over that with you during one of our 10-minute breaks that we will
Okay.
have pretty frequently.
Great, thank you.
Yep, so let's see. Luca, go over Git/CLI. Is there anybody else who missed that or who needs a second run through for the Git and CLI install stuff?
I would like to. I'm Ray.
Okay, so all right, so Lazuka and Ray. All right, so I will
Thank
make
you.
a breakout room for us once we're done with the review part, so that way we can go over them. Is there anybody else at this time? Okay, I'm gonna assume not, so we're gonna keep going. So after, okay, let's say now, you've got your GitHub set up, which most of us have. The next thing that we can do on the command line is do something very helpful, which is cloning. So all the clone command really does is it just copies over whatever's on your GitHub link, and it just copies it over your computer. In order to do that, there are a couple of ways, but the easy way to do it is just type git. Well, first, also, whenever you do this, you really want to keep in mind which directory you're in. So if you take a look down here, oh, perfect. Here, let me make this window a tiny little bit smaller because this is giant. Okay, much better. So I'm actually in the main user directory of my computer, which is most of the time where your terminal is going to start off, which can be a good thing because from there it becomes really easy to change directories to wherever you want to go on your computer. But let's be honest, we really don't want to put a ton of extraneous files in our main user directory. A better place might be to change directory to your desktop. And then from there, go to I have the code platoon folder and then Delta and exercises. So it's always really, really, really helpful the moment that you open up your command prompt or terminal to say, okay, where am I in my computer? Is this where I necessarily want to be? And if it's not, make sure to go where you need to be, because this avoids the one critical mistake that I mentioned earlier of uploading your entire computer to GitHub. Because on many occasions, when you start out in just the main user directory, if you type in a git push or a git commit, it will create a new repository that uploads everything inside your main user directory, because that's the folder where you told it to go, up to GitHub, which is not great. And that's something we'd like to avoid. So whenever you start off, always, always, always double check the directory that you're in. Make sure that it's where you want to be. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do, once we go down here, we've changed to our directory, is we can go to, let's say I want to fork and let's say I want to clone git pair or fork git pair. So whenever we go to an exercise in Code Platoon and also elsewhere, we never in general want to edit the main master branch of something unless it's something that you own. So what we instead want to do is create a fork of it. And to do that, we literally just click the fork button. It'll create a new fork, which, as it says here, it's just a copy of a repository. Always make sure to do this before you start, downloading things or copying or changing things. And basically all this will do is it'll create a new fork with my username and that I own, and it's just the exact copy of git pair. And if you ever create a fork and let's say later on you forget where you forked it from, let's say it's like an old version of something, you can always just go to your GitHub, and if you look at the top left, it tells you what the name is, but it also tells you what the source was, which is Delta Platoon new/git pair, which is a very nice feature of GitHub. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is figure out how to clone this down onto our laptop. So if I go to the folder where that I'm in right now, let's see, can I make this bigger? Yes. Okay. So I'm in my Platoon Delta exercises folder. It's blank. I have my Git poetry exercise in there. And let's say that I want to add in the Git pair exercise. So the first thing that I need to do, again, we can go back to our very handy GitLab documentation. We have two options. Option one is to clone this using SSH, which basically will authenticate you using your GitHub email address. And then from there, it'll only authenticate you one time. It's a little bit cumbersome, but sometimes it can be helpful if you've got like a private repo, for example. The other option, which is a little bit easier, is using HTTPS, or basically just go to code, copy the HTTPS link right there, and then just type in git clone, paste, and hit enter. And if we wait a couple of seconds, we can see the other thing that I like about the terminal is that it shows you exactly what Git is doing. So, for example, cloning into Git pair, okay, it's cloned it. Then it tells you, okay, there's 3 objects in there. We're putting the 3 objects into the folder and we're done. And if I go into the folders on my laptop, we can see right here in Git pair that it has the README file, and that's it, which is exactly what we expected. So before I move on to the next parts of modifying, adding, and pushing, does anybody have questions about anything I just did? Okay, if not, the next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to create a new text document because, I'm not going to go through the whole Git pair exercise, just some of the main parts of it. But if you guys do have questions about the parts that we don't go over, feel free to bring them up. So I'm going to create a new text.
Umar, sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Is it best practice to use clone the first time that you download a repository and then just use pull from there, or is it fine to use clone every time?
That's a good question. Personally, I would use clone mostly every time because it creates a copy of it. You could use pull as well, but it's just standard practice to use clone instead of pull most of the time, if that helps. But yeah, that is a really good question. Because the other thing that does make pull a little bit less used is that pull tends to combine a clone, which is copy paste, with a merge, which is good, if you're working on something like in a team. At the same time, it's not great if you have, say, multiple different branches that you want to keep completely separate. So that's why we generally want to use git clone instead of git pull. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, man.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions before we continue? Okay, if not, let's get back into it. So the next thing that we can do is, I'm just following along a little bit of here, is we are going to create a text document, and we can call it, story.txt. We can, for example, go in here and say, hi, this is a story or something, save it. There are ways to do this from the command line too. We won't cover those today because those aren't really used as much, but if you guys want to later after lecture's over, feel free to let me know and I'll be more than happy to go over them. And then the next bit that we're going to do is so we've cloned over our stuff, we've made our changes, and now let's just make sure that this file of story.txt actually exists, because sometimes you might have a file that's like temporary in here or a file that's just loading. So what I always like to do is whenever I go into a folder, especially after doing a git clone, is just type in dir, which essentially just shows us everything that's inside of the folder in simple terms. So I've got, let me change my directory real quick to git pair, and now we can do the dir. And we'll see in there that we've got 2 files. We have the README, which is decently big, and then we have the story file, which is a lot smaller. And all right, let's maybe change that from story.txt to just story and run that one more time. Okay, so we've got our README and we've got our story.txt. So now what we need to do is, again, following, I'm only going to go through the A forks the repo part, but it says A will then commit and push up the changes. But in order to commit our changes, we first have to actually figure out what changes we want to commit. So does anybody remember what we have to do after we've changed something, but before we hit the commit button? Yes. So to do that, what I like to do is add files individually. It's for small projects like this. You can, of course, add in like the whole thing as a bunch, but let's say I don't want to change the README. I only want to upload my change story.txt. So then I'll just leave it at git add story.txt. We'll hit enter and we don't get any return. Okay, what does this mean? Does this mean that it hasn't been added? We don't know. So it hasn't at least thrown any errors, which is always a good sign. But whenever we do a change in Git, we always want to make sure that that change is actually being registered. So to do that, after I do literally anything, I'll always type in Git Status. And this shows us, for example, all right, I'm on the master branch, yep, which is where I intend to be. That's the same branch up here. It's up to date with origin master, which is good. And changes to be committed. This is the key part. I have my new file, which is story.txt. So the file that I wanted to add has been added. So now we just need to commit it. So what we can do is just do git commit. And then we want to add, let's say, a commit message. And we'll just say -m for that. And we'll just say added story. And now it says, all right, so we've added the story to the master. We've got one file change and one insertion. And then it created a mode for that, which I'm not too sure what that is. Again, you can always go into the documentation and read more about it. And that's basically all we have to do in order to commit something. So there's two more things that I'm going to talk about here, and then we'll pause for questions. So now that we've committed, I want to make sure that this is actually committed and that isn't just a fluke. So I'm going to go back to my Git status. And it says, okay, I'm on the master branch. It's ahead of the origin master by one commit. So, and it says there's nothing to commit. So what this means is all of the changes that I wanted to commit, I have committed. I don't have anything that's added but not committed. But my branch, which is what I've got here, is ahead of the origin by one commit, which means, like it says right there, I need to use git push to publish my local commits. So now I'm going to hit git push. We'll wait for a couple of seconds. Again, this is a smaller file, so it's not going to take that long. And this shows you, again, exactly whatever it's doing. It's saying, all right, it's counting all the objects that need to be pushed. It's compressing them. It's writing the objects. It tells you exactly where they're being written to, which is github.com/my username, and then the git pair.git, which is exactly where I pulled it from and which is where I want it to go. And it goes from master to master. So pushing appears to be done, but if we just go to git status, we'll double check that we're on the master branch. The branch is up to date. We do not have any commits that are lying around here, and we don't have anything to commit. So this is the general process that we're going to use whenever we start anything with a new exercise. We're going to pull down from the master branch after forking it over. We're going to clone it. We're going to make our changes. Then we're going to add the changes, commit them, and then finally push. So does anybody have any questions about this before we move on? Okay.
I actually do, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
The other day when we did our git push, he was talking about do git push origin master. Is there like a difference between just saying git push and then specifying the origin master branch?
So origin master is generally the default branch that it'll get pushed to, which is why I normally don't really say which branch to push to. Sometimes it will, instead of pushing origin master, you'll want to push it to another branch. And because of that, it's a good idea to specify where you're pushing it to. So for that reason, that's probably why they mentioned pushing to origin master specifically, which you can and honestly should do. Do you have to? No. Is it good just to avoid error? Yes.
Wait, so if you're on, say you're on some checkout branch, if you just use git push, will it push to the checkout branch or to master?
It depends on if you specify it, but for example, like here right now, I'm on a forked branch. But if we go back up to here, if that's the other reason why Git status is so important, because Git status tells you which branch it's comparing it to. So for example, here it says your branch is up to date with origin master, which means origin master is the place that it's comparing it to, it's the place that it's going to push it to, which is why when we go down to git push down here, doesn't exactly say which branch, but if we go back again to Git status, it's up to date with origin master. So whatever branch shows up in your Git status is the one that it's going to push to unless you specify otherwise.
So my question is, when after we fork it and then we trying to do a git clone, there are two choices seems there when we hit the code button, HTTPS and the SSH, doesn't matter which one we pick.
Indeed it does. So here, let me show those two right now. So we've got two different choices. The first one is HTTPS, and the second one is the SSH. So HTTPS is basically just a simple link. So, I can copy this, I can go into like an incognito window or something, paste it, and it won't work because it's an incognito window, but it'll link, if I were signed in and if it had access, it would link it to the GitHub that I have. Now, the SSH is different because for SSH, you need to have certain keys because SSH is for secured sharing. So for that, you need to set up some different things in the back end. You need to add in public keys, for example, like it says here to GitHub. And that's the only way that SSH can work. It's password protected. Most of the time, we're just going to use the GitHub HTTPS. And the link that I think I sent over in Slack, yeah, the link that I sent over in Slack should be a little bit more helpful with regarding the details for the differences between those, but 99.9% of the time, you are always going to use the HTTPS. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, exactly what I was wondering. Thank you.
All right, any others? Okay, if not, I'm going to show you guys a little trick. So let's exit, make sure we exit out of the command prompter console properly using the exit command. It closes it out, beautiful. I'm going to go back onto my computer here. I'm going to delete the git pair exercise, and I'm just going to refresh my GitHub here. And look at that, we can see that I've got story.txt and it has hi, this is a story written there. Boom, perfect. So that's always a good way to double check that worked. Now, the next thing we're going to do is figure out how to do this without the console at all, which is a method that I personally like using a lot, especially for big projects, but it's always important to know how to use the console method as well. So I'm just going to pop open my VS Code, I'm going to close out of this, and I'm going to go over to source control. And feel free to do this on your own as well if you'd like. So how have you guys set up your VS Code to interface with GitHub yet? So in other words, if you go to open up your VS Code and you hit the three little dots on the left, does everybody see this thing for source control?
I do.
Okay. Actually, let me rephrase the question. Does anybody not see this in their VS Code?
I see the Git poetry and then the Git pair.
Okay. So what you might want to do is go to File and then New Window, because that'll close out of the things that are currently in your VS Code, and it'll create a blank new window for us to play around it.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm assuming that most folks, if not everybody, can see this. So once we do that, the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to copy paste in the link for my Git pair fork. You guys can copy it in for yours. And I'm just going to go into clone repository. And what it says here is provide repository URL or repository source. The URL means the HTTPS bit. So I'm going to paste that in. And that's my URL. Actually, I think I need to do pair.git. And we'll clone it. And now it says choose a folder to clone to. So if I go into Platoon, Delta, exercises, select repository location, and we wait a few seconds and it clones it down. And now it says, would you like to open the cloned repository? And we hit open. And we'll say, yes, I trust the authors. Boom. We have not used the command line once. This is all entirely in VS Code, and we've successfully cloned our repository. And if I go ahead and check in my files, because I want to make sure it actually exists where I want it to, Git Poetry is back, or oops, Git pair is back with the story. Does that make sense? Does anybody have questions about how I did that? Okay, if no one has any questions about that, let's say that I want to make some changes. I'm going to say this is an even better story. Save that. We'll wait a second. And this is the way that, again, we're going to do 99% of our coding in VS Code. So whenever you save something and you've got a Git thing opened in VS Code and you've changed it, if we go ahead and see that there's a little 1 button in our source control, and if we go over there to see what's up, we see that it says that a file's been changed. And which file's been changed? And this one says modified. Story.txt is the one that's been changed, which is exactly what we're looking for. But now let's say that I'm going to add in a second story. Let's say I'll call this story2.txt. Go there and say, this is story2. I hit save. We go over here. And if we go over to story 2, it says that it's untracked, basically meaning this is a brand new file. So now I've got 2 files that have been changed within my Git pair, and I want to push both of those up to my fork. How do I do this? So the first thing that we need to do, like Robert mentioned earlier, is once we've done changes, we need to add them so that they can be committed. So I can go either file by file here to stage changes, or I can stage all of them. So for right now, we'll stage each of them one by one, add story and story 2. And then I can just hit the commit button, and this will commit them. And once I hit that, we come up with a little bit of a dialog box here that says, please enter the commit message for your changes. And basically I can just say, change story, added story 2, save that commit message and close out of it. And now we see that those have been committed. And the last thing that we need to do is sync our changes, which pushes it up to origin master. We hit that, we hit OK. We wait for it to finish running, and we don't need to run git fetch. And that's it. Now this has been updated. So again, bypassing the console completely, just using VS Code itself, we're able to clone something down, edit it, add and commit our changes, and push back up to GitHub. And again, let's make sure that this is actually happening and it's not just some weird magic going on behind the scenes. Look at that. We see that the README is the initial one. We see that story has been changed because of that new commit that I just did, and story 2 has been added. So this is the exact same result that would have happened if we did this through the console, but it's just a more visually intuitive way to do it. And it also just makes it a little bit easier to fix errors whenever you're committing and just to visually see what's going on. So those are the 2 main ways that people will commit in GitHub. Again, you're either going to use the console or you're going to use VS Code. Some people also have like the GitHub desktop app, which I've never used, but some folks do tend to use that. But basically anything that you do in order to push your changes up from your computer to GitHub and pull them back down should work. But these are just the main two. Feel free to use whichever ones you like, but it's important to know how to use both. So that was the mini review of the GitHub section. Does anybody have any questions about it before we move on to the JavaScript stuff?
I like the VS Code version a lot better.
Yeah, a lot of people do. It's a lot easier, but the one thing that is not so fun about it is because it is a GUI. It's a little bit harder to track those very weird errors. So I would maintain caution while using it, but it's a lot easier to use than the console.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions, comments, concerns, things of that nature?
Can you show us how it is, how you can delete something if you had to, a repository or a...
Like delete a repository in GitHub?
Yeah, in GitHub.
Oh, let's see. I actually have never done that. But let's experiment. So if I go to, let's say, my repositories, I've got Git pair here. Pretty sure. There we go. So I'm in Git pair. Let's say I want to get rid of Git pair because I don't like it, or I want to make a new one, or something similar to that. If we go down here to the danger zone, which is just all the way in the settings tab, go all the way down to the bottom, we can do a couple of things. So, well, this is a fork, so I can't change the visibility of the fork. I can't change the ownership. I can archive it and make it read only, or I can delete it. So if I hit delete, it'll say this action cannot be undone. Basically, bad things can happen, which is not great. So I'll just type in my username and halfway to it. And I've hit, I understand the consequences, delete this repository. Okay, that's interesting. I did not know that it had two-factor authentication involved. But anyway, all right, so now I have to type in the digits on my phone. If I hit approve, as you can see here, the repository has been successfully deleted. So now my repo is gone. So that's basically the main way that people can delete something. It will do that even if it's as simple as a fork from a repository that literally has a text file. So that's the main process that people will go through to delete a repository. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So what if it's something that you'll be working on with others? You definitely don't want deleted. So there's no warning on the other side telling them that somebody wants to delete it.
I think that depends on the permissions, because you might, like, if you're not the owner of the repository, but you try to delete it, or there are multiple co-owners, they might get an email or something saying, hey, so-and-so wants to delete this repository, please, will you let them do that? But otherwise, no, I don't believe that they'll get a notification.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. The other thing that's kind of nice about GitHub is that if I go to, like, and as you can see, Git pair doesn't exist anymore, even if I try to go find it. So the other thing that I do like about this is if I go over to, let's say, Git poetry, there is no giant delete button anywhere. So in order to delete it, I actually have to go to the settings and then go all the way down to the specifically labeled area that says this is the area for deletion, which really helps you avoid accidental deletions of your Git stuff. Which I think is pretty great. But yeah, that was a really good question. Does anybody else have any questions or concerns regarding GitHub, VS Code thing that I just showed, or anything at all?
Anyway, how about the merge? Because last Tuesday, think we had a hard time with merging.
Okay, so why? So all right, so for merging, actually, this might actually be a good time to take a 10-minute break. And during that break, Celine, do you want to maybe come to the breakout room that I'm
Yeah,
going to
sure.
set up with Lizuka and Ray, because we're going to go over basically this stuff again for the Git and CLI install. And anybody else who hasn't gone through the installation process or has had trouble with it. Let's see if I can I start a breakout room? Assignment. Cool. All right, so I just created a breakout room. We're going to take a 10-minute break, so we'll come back at, let's say, 6:32. And then Lizuka, Ray, and Celine, if you guys all want to hop in with me, and whoever else would like to as well, that would be great. So I'll see you guys in 10 minutes. And for, again, Lizuka, Ray, Celine, and whoever else wants to join, I'll see you guys in breakout room 1 in a couple seconds. Okay, if there aren't any questions right now, I'm going to go ahead and there we go, start sharing. All right, so let's say, actually, I'm going to share my whole window because this is something that is really easy to have problems with, and I know I have on multiple occasions. So let's say that I'm going to open up my VS Code. And when I do so, once it decides to load, it opens up a repository or a folder that I was in before, which is not where I want to be. Because let's say I want to create a brand new file somewhere, not necessarily in this Git pair folder. What do I do? How do I get out of here? So there's a couple of options. The first thing that we'd naturally try is, okay, well, let me just try closing out of the files. But I'm still in this Git pair repository, which is not where I want to be. So I need to basically exit the repository. The simplest way to do that is to go to File and then New Window. And that basically just starts you out from scratch, like this untitled one thing, which is perfect. This is exactly what we want. So then you can just close out of the other one and we're back over to where we started. Does that make sense? Any questions there? Okay, so if there aren't any questions, we are now going to move on to something that I think is pretty fun, which is going to be our first actual coding, which is JavaScript. So JavaScript is another language, much like Python, but different, and some may say more cumbersome, which is mostly used in order to help make interactive stuff on websites. So for example, if you've seen like, say, flashy banners or those cool drop downs on websites that when you mouse over them have like a small sound effect and they have like a mini animation, that's all JavaScript in the backend. JavaScript is not used very much for actual like algorithms or coding. It's mostly just used for honestly pretty stuff or simple things on websites. But because JavaScript is a language, we're going to go into it in pretty much the exact same depth that we're going to use Python, which is used for a lot more of the backend stuff, which we're also going to talk about. So now that I'm in VS Code, usually what I like to do is not just start typing, and I like to hit the actual select a language. And as you can see, there are a lot of languages that I've got loaded up here. But the thing that we can do is type in JavaScript, and there's two options. One is normal JavaScript, and the other is JavaScript React. We are always going to click for the first 3/4 of this course. Click the regular JavaScript button, because JavaScript React is something completely different that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So we're going to create a new untitled file. And the second thing that I'm going to do is save it. So let me just go here and just say JS demo. And we want to double check that our file type here is being saved as JavaScript and not some other weird thing like Bash or C++. So I've got my file now, which is jsdemo.js, which is exactly what I want. So the next thing that I want to do is, and again, feel free to follow along at home in your own VS codes while doing this too, because the best way to learn is by learning along with someone. So the next thing we're going to do, once I've got my JS file made, is to create a new terminal window. And we'll wait for it to load up. I'm going to just change directories to where my file is located. We'll go desktop, code to Delta check the directory. Okay, that's nice. Okay, maybe it needs quotes. Okay, there we go. Now if I type in directory, it shows my jsdemo.js, which is exactly what I'm looking for. So has everybody reached this point in VS Code where you've got your JavaScript file, it's saved on your computer, and you are able to navigate to it in the terminal window?
Yeah, sorry, quick question. Would you mind explaining why you had to put quotes around the code platoon? Was it because of the space?
Yes. So
Got it.
sometimes in Windows terminal, I'm pretty sure in Mac as well, if you just do it in the normal terminal itself, it'll be okay. It'll just run normally. The CD command, that is. But in more archaic systems like Linux or older versions of terminal, they do not like spaces at all because they think a space is a demarcator between two commands. Like, for example, when we type like git commit, we put a space in between them because git is one thing and commit is another. So when I write code platoon with space, it thinks, oh, hey, code is one thing, platoon is another. I don't see a thing called code or platoon. Error. And that's why it throws a problem. But if you were to put them with quotes around it, it doesn't think it's an error because it recognizes, oh, these are quotes. That means this is a string. So it's not a command. So we're good. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, cool.
Would you mind showing us real quick the whole process? I got behind.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing that we're gonna do here is we're just go to File, New File, and we'll create a JavaScript. Oh, let's do a text file, and then hit select the language. We're gonna type JavaScript, hit Enter. It create this untitled one thingy, and we're just going to save it in a location on our computer, and then just go open. And then after that, we'll go to Terminal, New Terminal. And then it decided to restart. Once we're in the terminal, we're just going to change our directory to the place where that new file is. And again, this is also just showing that one more time. We need to have quotes whenever we're typing things in the terminal here, because otherwise it shows us a positional parameter cannot be found that accepts this as the argument, because again, platoon comes after the space in there. But if we type it with quotes around the space, we're okay.
Okay.
Okay. Yep, no problem. Does anybody else have any questions right now about that? Okay, I'm going to assume no one else has any questions about just making a JavaScript file and going to where we are in the code. So the first thing that we want to do, let's just do a really simple hello world because it's the easiest way to get started with language and it's the standard thing that everyone does. So obviously, the first thing that we need to do is type out, well, hello world. But just typing that out isn't actually going to help us with anything because we need a way to print hello world. So in order to print something out, what we have to do is use a console.log. Here, let me move this up to the top. There we go. If I type in console, and it shows us as a variable, and now I type in .log, which is a function. And the thing I really like about VS Code is if you have enough extensions installed, it will predict what you're typing next. And console.log is the thing that I'm trying to type out here. So let's say console.log, and then it says data any, which means this is going to print out whatever we put inside of these parentheses. And we'll put a semicolon at the end of the line and hit save. The one's gone away, so I have my console log written out. Now, the next thing is we've got our file, which is great. But once we have our file, we kind of need to actually run the file. In order to run this, what I'm going to do is type in, well, first I need to go to my directory and double check the name of my file. It's jsdemo.js. So now, once everyone's done this, what I want you to do is type in node and then the name of the file with the JavaScript at the end and hit, uh-oh, okay, that is weird. This was just working yesterday. Okay, well, that should work.
I got mine to work by not putting the .js, just putting the name of the file.
You know what? That is probably it. Let's try that. Okay, it appears that it wants to break now. Here, let me try stopping my share for a second, and let me try running this in command prompt. This is also part of the fun of programming, debugging on the fly. Trust me, this will happen to you at least one time during the cohort. Delta, what is this? Okay, actually, we're going to take a 5-minute break here while I figure out what on earth is going on with my VS Code, and we will return as soon as that is over. So if you guys were able to get it working, though, that is good. Feel free to take a 5-minute break. If you haven't been able to get it working at this point, like myself, take the 5 minutes to try to figure out what is going on, and we will return in 5. All right. So let me just really quickly change my directory one more time. Okay, cool. So hopefully you guys can see my console and screen. So I've still got the hello world written up there. Actually, I'm going to make this. I'm going to change my share really quickly to just show VS Code, because this is okay, much less messy now. All right, so I'm in my Delta directory. If I double check the directory, I've got my JS demo in there, and I've got my console log saying hello world up there. So the first thing that we can do is just type in, again, node, and then JS demo, and that'll just run our hello world, which is exactly what we want. So node is basically the thing that lets us run a JavaScript file in the console or on our local computer. The console log is basically saying, hey, this is the console, which is our terminal, the place where we type stuff. And I want to log, aka print out to it, this whatever string is in here. And in this case, it's hello world. So whenever we type the node.js demo, it says, okay, I'm going to run this file. It's going to say, okay, I want to go to the console. I want to print out to the console this thing. And that's the gist of why the hello world operation works. So now that we've got hello world working, let's see if we can make it a little bit more fun. So the first thing that we can do is add in some variables. So variables are something that we use a ton in programming, obviously. And the way we define variables in JavaScript is a little bit weird. So the first thing that we do is something kind of like in like a math proof or something, where it's sort of like we say let, and then let will become weird and highlighted, which means it knows, okay, so we're going to be defining something. So let's say that we'll call this name. I'll say let name equal boom. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, let means I'm going to make a variable. So I'm telling JavaScript, hey, I am going to be defining a variable here. Then I'm going to say, okay, the variable is going to be called name. And if I go up here, you can actually see that it recognizes name is going to be an object or a something. It doesn't know what, but it knows it's going to be something. And now I'm saying, okay, I'm going to set the value of this thing to be equal to boomer, which is my name. So now we can go do console log hello world, or instead of that, I can console log my name instead. And if we do this, do node.js demo again, it console logs my name, which is all. So the main way that we'll use variables in JavaScript is to hold things just like this. So, let name equal. We can also do other things. We can say like let, I don't know, like hello phrase equal hello, and then put a space, and then to put another semicolon. And we can do something fun here with strings, because again, putting quotes around something makes it a string. If I just type my name like this, it would think that's not a string, that's a variable or a function or some other type. So whenever we have something like hello or a name or something that we don't want to be, that we want to be like a string, we have to put double quotes around it. You can use single quotes, but we won't use those for right now, and we'll talk about why a little bit later. So just to do some other fun things, we can say combine two strings together. So if I do hello phrase plus name, because both of these, oh, and name is deprecated. Okay, let me just say, let me change this to my name. That in there. So if I combine hello phrase and my name, this will quite literally add together the two strings. So if I go to node demo here, it takes hello phrase, which is hello, which is right there, and then it puts my name after it. So it says hello Boomer, for example. But it can only do that because these two are both strings, which is really, really important. So let's say now that that I have a number. So let's say number 1, and somebody give me a number that is your favorite or not favorite number.
21.
All right, so let number 1 be 21, and let's say number 2, somebody else give me another number.
7.
7. Okay, so I've got 2 numbers now. So I'm going to make a new console log, and I want to print out number 1 plus number 2. So if we did this right, these two are both numbers. So it should print out, here we'll comment all of this out. And the way we do comments in JavaScript, by the way, there's 2 ways to do it. The easy way is to use the double slashes. And the even easier way to do it is in VS Code. If you hit Control if you're on Windows or Command if you're on Mac and hit the slash button, it will automatically comment out that line, which is why you can see me doing that super easily instead of typing in the double slashes each time. I highly recommend using that, especially if you're commenting out big blocks of code. Just select the whole thing, hit Control or Command and the slash tool, and you can comment or uncomment it at will. It's fantastic. Okay, so if I add, so I'm taking number 1, which is 21, and I have number 2, which is 7. If I run this, we should get 28, which we do. Great. But now, let's see what happens if I try adding a number to something that's not a number, like hello phrase, for example. So what do you guys think will happen if we add 21 to hello?
Is it just going to
Syntax error.
concatenate it?
Okay, so I've got a couple of different choices, right? One is it might just combine the two. The second one is it'll throw an error. So let's see what happens. Okay, well, it looks like it does end up concatenating, which, isn't great. And is that what we expected? It might be, it might not. Is that what we wanted? Maybe. It really depends on what you wanted, but most of the time it's not. But the thing to keep in mind here is if you do something really weird, like adding together a string and a number, it will end up concatenating, which is not always something that you want. So making sure that you're watching out for different types in JavaScript is extremely, extremely, extremely important. And we have a couple of types that we're going to use. We've got, again, you've got your standard strings, we've got longer strings, we've got straight variables and strings, we've got numbers, Booleans, and so on. So let's walk through a couple of those. So here, let me delete this. And actually, yeah, we'll delete this. So the first type that we have are integers. So integers are just your really basic normal number. I'll just say let int1 equal like 15. That's the easiest way to set up a number. So it's an integer, it's a whole number. The second thing that we can do is set up a float, and a float is a decimal. So for that, we can say let like float1 equal 1.23 or something like that. So now we can try something fun, which is always something good to try out in a language. What happens if you add together a whole number and a decimal? Do you guys think that it will end up with a whole number at the end, a decimal, or it'll throw an error? What do you all think?
I mean, I think it's going to be 16.23. Either that or it's going to be 1.23.
Okay, that's a good response. Is there anybody here who thinks it'll be just 16 on
I
its own?
kind of am leaning towards that. I forgot, but I think it just goes to the whole number unless you specify, but I forgot.
I think that's
Okay.
Python. For JavaScript, it'll keep the float, right? And then Python, it would change it, correct?
Yeah, I was thinking it was going to remember the float, but I did remember they were separate.
Yeah, so there are some languages, like for example, if we were to be doing this in C programming right now, you have to actually, you can't just use a let. You actually have to define the type as an integer or a float. Whereas here we can just say, we're just going to let this hold an integer. So I see we've got a bunch of different ideas here. Let's just test it and see what happens. If we hit the no button, we can see here that it does actually end up being 16.23. Which, may or may not be what we want. But the important thing to keep in mind here is adding integers and floats gives you a float. So it is not going to automatically round for you, which isn't great, but okay, that's for some things it's fantastic. For others, not so much. So here, let me comment this console logout because we don't need that anymore. The next thing that we want to do is talk about Booleans. So for example, a Boolean is just a true or false statement. So the way we set it up in here is we could say like, let, I don't know, it is cold outside equal true. And we can console.log that and they'll say true. Now, the other thing that we can do if, let's say that we want to turn this from true to false, there's two ways we can do it. One thing that we can do is we can say that just equals false, which is, okay, we can do that. The other thing that we can do is we can say, this should work. Uh-oh. And this just decided to freeze up. Okay. Come on. There we go. All right, cool. So the first thing that we can do is say, we can, if we want to decide to flip this around, we can say it is cold outside equals false because there's only two Booleans, true or false. That's the easy way to do it. The second way, which is something that you'll be using a lot more later, is the not operator. So have you guys used the not operator before, or the exclamation mark?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I don't need to go over that in too much depth then. But that's basically if we wanted to flip it around or add it into an if statement or something like that, we could just basically say not, or the exclamation mark, it is cold outside. And then that'll be false. So we've got a couple more types, and then we'll move on to some more fun things. So the first type that we're going to talk about right now is undefined. So what we can do is we could say, I don't know, let's say like number of cars. And we can just say that this is undefined. So what that means is this isn't going to be an integer or a float or a string or anything at all. This is just something that it might get a value later, but it doesn't have one right now. And something that we can try, for example, is let's say that let's say that number of cars, we never define it. And let's say we just say, okay, I need to add 3 to this number. If I run this, I get an NaN error. And NaN just basically means this can't be done. It doesn't make any logical sense. Because again, you can't add 3 to an undefined quantity. So, however, what we can do is we can, if we do say after this number of cars equals like 4, this gives number of cars a definition. And if I run this, now I say, okay, well, 4 plus 3 is 7. So updating the variable value does work. But if I just say that number of cars equals undefined, it doesn't. The other good thing about defining a variable as undefined is I could also say number of cars equals this is a car or something. It could also be a string because again, we're leaving it as undefined. I'm not saying it's a number. I'm not saying it's a string. I'm not saying it's anything. It could be a string too. Because of that, even though if I could also very easily say number of cars equals the number 4, and it would still work. I could say the number of cars is true for whatever reason that you would want a number of cars to be true, and it still works. So undefined basically means we can give this variable any value at some point, and it will still be fine. However, if we did something like say that number of cars equals 15, and then number of cars equals true, a lot of languages will throw an error when you do that. Right now, it doesn't because JavaScript is a bit more permissible than other languages, but some languages will say, hey, why are you letting a number turn into a Boolean? That feels wrong. So just keep that in mind when you're working with JavaScript. Okay, there's one more value that we're going to talk about here, which is null. So null just basically means nothing and that there's nothing there. So it's different from undefined because undefined said that this doesn't have a definition yet. What null means is that this does not have a definition full stop, and more than likely it never will. And if we go to our node and run it, we can see here that it shows us null in this very different color that's yellow. So just keep that in mind as well, because you will use null quite a bit. For example, if you're looking at like inputting, if you're taking an input from a text field, for example, and no one types anything, you'll want to check, say, is that input equal to null? And then if it is, you'll do something. If it isn't, then you won't. So these are just the main types of variables and data types that we'll deal with, at least starting out in JavaScript. Before we move on to things like objects, does anyone have any questions so far?
Yeah, I got one. So earlier,
Go for
after you declared another variable, it said that your first variable was deprecated. Why is that? I mean, it still works if you run the program where it concatenates, but it does show that it's deprecated for some reason.
So you're talking about the one where I called it name, right?
Yes, name, and then you had hello phrase was the next variable you declared.
Right. So here, let me just set name to be like, let's say the name is James. And we'll say print hello and then plus name. So you'll notice when I type name here, let me see, okay. Well, when I type name here, it shows it in purple and it shows it with like a little crossed out line. And that's because name works. What deprecated means is that it's not a constant. So the old definition of name in some version of JavaScript was that name was probably some sort of like a data type or a protected word that you can't call a variable. So otherwise it would throw a big problem. It's like, for example, if I said like let else equal 5, you can't do that because else is a protected name. You can't name a variable else because it's used for something else. So what deprecated means here is that name at some point probably was used for like a default function or an if else statement or something protected that you can't use as a variable. But now it's not used as that. So you can use it as a variable name, which is why if I were to run this right now, not print, oops, console log.
Python,
Yeah, console log, it says hello, James. Because again, its name is deprecated, so we can use it. But this also serves as like a word of caution because name is deprecated, but it could be used somewhere else. So we don't want to use something overly generic. You'd say something in general like my name. And then if I said my name, that's not a protected word. and it still works, of course, but we don't run into any issues there with deprecation or anything like that. Does that explanation help a little bit?
Yep, for sure. Thanks.
Yep, no problem. Also, while we're talking about variable names, I will often see a lot of people do something like let A equals 1, let B equals this is a house. A and B do not tell me a single word about what this variable is for. A could be for like the number of apples sitting in my backyard to, I don't know, the number of signed baseballs that somebody owns. We don't have any details. So please, please, please do not use like single letters for your variable names. Or if you do, which I really do not recommend, please add a comment and tell us what this is for. So that's the first word of caution I have. The second one, again, make sure that your names aren't using protected statements. So like you could say, you can't say let if equals true. That just doesn't work. Or you could say something like, or let like is. That's also something that's really, really not recommended. Well, you could say something like, is cloudy. If you want to do that, and then add in a comment here that says, is the weather cloudy? And just make everything as simple as possible. So that way somebody looking at your code after, or even you looking at your code after a night of very, very tired coding can understand what's going on with your variables. So let's say that, we do have a variable called like is cloudy or something. So there's a couple of ways, there are three main ways that people will name their variables. So one thing that people will do is just say is cloudy, like all in lowercase, which is, the relatively easy approach. The second thing that people will do is they'll say let, and then is, and then an underscore for cloudy, which helps to separate out the words. And that's also another good convention. And the third one that people will do is they'll use camel case. And they'll say let, like is cloudy like this. Now, one thing to note, all of these variables have the exact same words in them, but JavaScript will think that there are three different things. But if I said like let is cloud equals 3, 4, and then 5, and then I said console.log, and then I said is cloudy plus a lowercase one, we get 8 because it thinks this is different from this guy. So capitalization really matters when it comes to variable names. And the same thing if you put in like underscores, for example, is underscore cloudy is different from is cloudy without an underscore, which is different from is cloudy with a capital C. So make sure whenever you're naming your variables, A, that you use a consistent naming convention, and B, that you remember what the variable is called. Because this has happened to me many times, where let's say that I say like let the house, or I don't know, let's say is TV equals true. And then I go all the way down like to like line 100 or something. And then by accident, I write is TV there. And you don't catch it initially, but and then I run my code, and then later on it'll say is TV is not defined. And I'll be like, I'm pretty sure I defined that variable somewhere. And it turns out it wasn't defined because I capitalized TV here. I kept it lowercase down here. So that's something really important to keep in mind when you're coding is make sure that your variables are consistent. Also, make sure to use a consistent naming schema. You don't want to have some variables in camel case and then some variables in this is a variable. Don't do that. Keep it all the same. It just really helps with code readability. And the last thing is, again, make sure to add in a comment like for is TV could be like Boolean is the object a TV or not. Like just something simple, a couple of words to describe what the variable's for. We're going to use that a lot when we're pseudocoding, but also just a lot, when just regular coding too. It's extremely helpful, and especially once you get into really big projects where the names get confusing. A couple of words takes a couple of seconds, but it helps immensely with after you code them. Any questions there before we continue? Okay, I'm going to assume that there aren't any questions right now. So the next thing that we're going to move on to is arrays. So arrays and lists in Python are pretty similar. But what we do for an array is we don't use let in JavaScript. Instead, we're going to use const, which means that we're setting something as a constant. So we can call this constant, I don't know, numbers. And it says, okay, I'm going from left to right here. I'm setting up something that's going to be a constant. I'm calling that thing numbers. And then in order to open up an array, I'm going to use the square bracket. And the good thing about VS Code is that it'll automatically close your brackets for you. So what I generally like to do is put in the opening and closing brackets, and then put a semicolon just so I don't forget it at the end, and so that JavaScript doesn't yell at me about syntax. And then after that, let's say that I want to have somebody give me a couple of numbers.
5, 10, 15.
Okay, so let's say I want to create an array, which is basically just like a giant group of these numbers. So what I want to do then is type in the 5, but then to create the next element of the array, we're going to separate them out by commas. 5, 10, and 15, like that. If I were to type 5, 10, 15, that would not work, as you can see, and it throws an error. And why does it throw an error? Because VS Code tells us right there, we expect a comma. Where's the comma? So keep an eye out for whenever little syntax errors like that pop up. It's very easy to just miss the comma tab, but when you do, just note that that can throw a really large error. So, all right, let me change it from numbers to, I don't know, food. And then we can say something like apple, pear, banana, and cake or something. So let's say now that I want to print out the whole array. Well, we can do that. We can console log food. And if I move this and click node here, this is the way that JavaScript will console log or print out an array. It prints it out basically in the exact same way that you write it. But now, let's say that I want to print out a specific element. Like, let's say that I want to access banana. So can someone walk me through how I would get JavaScript to print out the word banana from that list?
By the index.
Okay, how would we do that?
Square bracket 2, 0, 1, 2. Yep.
Perfect. Good. That's exactly what I was looking for. So the thing to keep in mind for JavaScript is when we go to indices, apple is going to be index 0. Pear is index 1, banana is index 2, because JavaScript is a good language in that it starts out with a 0 index, just like Python. We start out at 0 at the beginning. So food 0 is going to be apple. So if I run that, we get apple. Now, what would happen if I ran food -1? Any ideas?
Get cake.
Why would we get cake?
Because it takes the last index.
Exactly. So that what the -1 does is it says, okay, I know our index 0 is apple, and that's the beginning. So -1 is going to flip us all the way around to here. And -2 is going to go here. And so on. If I run this, interesting. It shows us undefined. I wonder why that could be. Do we have any ideas as to why it says undefined? There's one really simple answer to why.
Python that works.
It's Python. Oh, I don't know.
Yep, pretty much, because you nailed it. This is one of the divergences between JavaScript and Python. Python is an even more permissive language than JavaScript. You can type really weird stuff like food -3 and it'll work. With JavaScript, though, JavaScript is somewhat derived from Java, which is a pretty rigid programming language, and it copies over some elements of its array syntax from that. So that's why saying something like food -1 doesn't work, and it'll throw you an undefined because it says, all right, 0 is here, -1 is one element before that, that goes outside of the array. What's going on? In the same fashion, if I said food 10, I don't have 10 elements here. And if I run that, I also get undefined. So unfortunately, James, if I wrote food -1 in Python, what you said would be exactly correct, because Python does have that little wraparound feature. JavaScript, not so much, which is a little bit annoying, but that's the way that JavaScript works. So any questions about what we just did and why it does what it does? Okay, I have a couple more array methods for you guys that I want to share. And you can find a really long list of all of the array methods in here. I just slacked it out. So for JavaScript, something very useful to do is either go to W3 Schools or the Mozilla web documentation, because they have a lot of resources and docs about anything and everything JavaScript that I highly recommend. So we're just going to try out a couple of array methods just to show you guys what they do. So one example is, let's see, what's a good one? We can do concatenation. So let's say that I come up with another list that's like more food. And we could do something like, I don't know, cookies and pizza or something. So now what I want to do is I want to combine these two lists. So what I can do is say food.concat, which is concatenation, it combines them. And then in here, and if I say put in the parentheses, it tells us exactly what this does. And it says that this can combine 2 or more arrays, and it doesn't modify either array. If I want to combine food and more food together, this is basically the same, like basically adding arrays together. If I run this, we see that we've got everything in food, and then we have the other things that are from more food, which is exactly what we want. Let's see, what's another thing that we can try? Oh yeah, there's a bunch of other like somewhat, I wouldn't call them useless, but they're interesting. So we can try the fill command, for example. So what fill does is it fills up a section of the array with a value of our choice. So let's say that I wanted to change everything in food from, healthier, slightly healthier options to candy. And if I want to do that, then I'll just say, let's say I want to keep the apples, but we'll start off at position 1, and we'll say everything else after this is going to be candy. So then what I'm going to say is, all right, I'm going to fill candy starting from index 1. And if I run this, as you can see, we get apple, but then index 1, 2, and 3 all change to candy. So this can be helpful if we want to say, if we have an array of numbers and we want to turn them all to 0, or if we just want to blank out the values in the array with undefined. We can do that here too. We can say like apple and then undefined, undefined, undefined. So that way we can define those values later. Does that make sense? Any questions about that before I move on to some other array methods? Okay, if there are any questions, I'm also going to just really quickly go over how to change values in an array. So right now, after this, we have food.fill. So it's apple, undefined, undefined, undefined. But what I do want to do instead, or actually here, let me just double check that this will actually work. Perfect. So let's say that we, again, food, we're going to fill this up and it becomes apple, undefined, undefined, undefined. But now let's say I want to modify an element of food. Let's say I want to modify this first undefined here, and I want to call it pear. Then what I can do, except that it's just like in Python, you just say, the array, the index, and whatever you want to set it to. And that works out perfectly. So that is a very useful tool that we have in JavaScript in order to modify an array. Another really stupid thing we can do in JavaScript is add in elements of different types, which personally, I don't understand why you'd ever want to do this. But let's say that, you could say food 1 is like the number 3, food 2 is true. And if I did that, again, note initially food is only, I can delete this one. Food is right now only full of strings. But if I can put in an integer into pair and replace a pair with an integer, and that works. I can replace banana with a Boolean and it works. So just keep that in mind when you're working with JavaScript. It's not very good about discerning between data types. Be very careful when you're dealing with different data types in JavaScript, because it will not correct for you and it will not tell you, hey, you have two things that are different data types in here. Is that necessarily what you're looking for? JavaScript does not do that, unfortunately. So next thing that we can do is we're going to talk about something called an object, which is basically the same thing as a dictionary in Python, but with a little bit of a different syntax. So let's say that I have a car. So what are some defining features of a car?
Has wheels.
Okay. It has wheels. And then, so this is going to be our key. And then we're going to say by default, it's true. What are some other properties of a car?
Color.
Okay. Yeah. So we could do color, and then that could be like blue. And then we could say like year. And then we could say that the year is like 2017 or something like that. So this is, yeah, we could keep adding more and more and more terms until the end of, the end of time. And that's something that we will end up doing a little bit later when we start getting into databases. But just to keep it simple, we'll stick to these three terms for now. So what we can do is, let's say that I want to double check the car's color. I'll do console log and then car, and to get the color, just like in an array, use the exact same syntax of a square bracket, and then we'll just type in color. And I can save that and run it. And it tells us that the color of the car is blue. But now, let's say that I want to change the car's color. So I'll just do it again. It's the exact same thing as in an array. I'll say car color, and I'll just change it to red, for example. And if I run that, we can see it changes it to red. However, we can try something else that's a little bit fun too. Let's say I want to add a property to car. Is there a way, do you think, let's say I want to add in make. And let's say that I will call it, I don't know, Toyota. And let's say that I run this. Or actually, let's say I just log car. What do you think will happen if I do this?
Oh, you'll see all the properties of car.
So we will see all the properties, but will we see make, or will it throw an error, or will nothing happen?
I think it's gonna
I think you'll see
push
it.
it into the object. Yeah, I think it'll push it into the object.
Okay, does anyone think it won't? Okay, let's see what happens. So if we run this, and we go down to the bottom here, so it says has wheels. Yep, it still says has wheels. It's blue. The year is 2017, and it does indeed push the make into the car. So again, that's something else to keep in mind as well. Is when working with JavaScript, it will add things if you so choose later on. So keep that in mind as we're working here. Let's see, is there anything else that's good to talk about right now? We could probably talk a little bit about functions as well, because functions are defined a little bit differently from in Python. So going back to, have you guys done stuff with functions in Python yet? Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So it's not totally new. That's good. So the way we define things in Python is way simpler than in JavaScript. So for JavaScript, the first thing that we have to do is type the word function. So again, we have different things. We have let variable 1 equal 1, 2, 3. We have let array 1 equal 1, 2, 3, like that. And then we have something for defining, or sorry, this would be const. And then we have function, and I'll just say 1, 2, 3. And then we'll put in like parameter. We could call this call this like X and Y. And then after that, we'll just put in an opening. And then we'll just say, I don't know, return array 1. So what this does is it takes in 2 parameters, X and Y, whatever those are. It doesn't do anything with them, but it'll automatically return array 1. So if I do a console.log and I say 1, 2, 3, and I'd say like 12 and 34. What this should do is, which is what it does, it just returns our 1, 2, 3 array, because that's all that we told the function to do. Now, if I instead said, let's return a new array with X and Y, it'll also do that. It'll return 12 and 34, which is exactly what we told it to do. Now, there are multiple different ways that we could have defined this function as well. So the thing that we're doing right now is the standard way to define a function. We're just saying function and then putting in our brackets. The second way that we can define it is we can say const, say 1, 2, 3 equals, and then put our parameters in, and then use a fat arrow, which is an equal sign and then a greater than sign. And this defines it the exact same thing. We can just call this like add nums2, call this add nums1. And again, these 2 functions do the exact same thing. They're just defined differently. And hopefully you guys see how we went between them. Again, to go from this guy to this guy, we replace function with const, and then we put in an equal sign over here, and then we add in an arrow right over there. Now, the last type of function, actually, this pretty much is the main type of function that we'll use. There is another one that we use on occasion too, which is just replacing const with a let. But the general forms of functions are either going to be writing the word function and then not putting anything there, putting in a bracket and putting your stuff in, or doing it the other way. But they both give you the exact same thing at the end. And we'll go over probably 2 more things tonight, and then we'll break for questions and take a short break before doing some problems. So the first thing that we're going to talk about now are conditionals. Again, just your standard if, else statements. So in Python, you've got if, elif, and else. Unfortunately, JavaScript is more boring than Python, and because of that, they don't have an elif, they have an else if, like with the 2 words written out separately. So for example, let's say that let's say we want to figure out if somebody was born in 2000s, the 1900s, or way before that. So we could say something like let birth year equal, I don't know, somebody give me a random year.
1776.
All right, 1776. So first thing, let's say we want to see if birth year is less than or equal, or is greater than or equal to 2000, then we could say something like console.log, you are a child. And that was not spelled correctly. All right, so that's our first statement. Now what we can do is let's try an else if. We could say else if, and then we could say birth year is greater than or equal to 1900, and then we could say console.log, you are not a child. And then we could say else, meaning if they're older than, or if their birth year was before 1900, we could say console.log, how are you still around? So if we run this program right now, what's going to happen is we'll start with birth year. It'll say, okay, I know birth year is 1776. Is birth year more than 2000? No. Is birth year more than 1900? No. So thus we go to the else statement, and if all runs correctly, we should get how are you still around, which we do, which is exactly what we want. But now let's say that we change birth year to like 1956. So it'll go to the first statement, They'll say no, birth year is not greater than 2000. So we'll go to the second statement. Yes, birth year is greater than 1900. And because of that, we should get your Untitled Chapter. So it works the exact same way that if statements work normally in other languages. So there's not really many changes there. So another thing to keep in mind are equal signs in JavaScript. So if we want to check if two variables are equal to each other, we will say, let me see, equals 2k. So let's say else console log not 2k. So let's say that we want to figure out if somebody was born in the year 2000 or not. If they were born in 2000, we're going to set that using the triple equal sign, not the double equals, the triple equals, which is something that you will rarely ever see used outside of JavaScript. But JavaScript likes triple equals for some unknown reason. So obviously 1956 is not the same as 2000. So because of that, we get not 2k. However, if I change this to 2000, then we get equals 2k. So if we want to check equality in JavaScript, use the triple equals. If you want to set a variable in JavaScript, use the single equals. And let's say that I say 1923 or something. So if I say if birth year single equals 2000, it still works for some very obscure reason, because it says now, let me see if I can do a console log birth year. So what's happening here is I'm saying, all right, let's let the birth year be 1923, but this is a single equals. It's not a triple equals. And a single equals is used to set a variable. So I'm saying is if, and I'm saying let birth year now be set to 2000. And JavaScript doesn't know how to react to that. It just says, okay, we'll let that be true. So then it says that it is equal to 2k and that it console logs our birth year, which is now changed. The birth year changed to 2000. But if I hit the triple equals there, it's not 2k because that does not, triple equals does not change the value of the variable. The single equals does. Does that difference make sense? Any questions about that? Alrighty, if there are no more questions about that, I'm going to move on to one last thing, which are loops, which are one of my favorite things to do in Python and JavaScript. So we can talk about, say, a while loop. So what we could do is, let's say that I have an array. So we'll say R1 equal 14, 27, 36, 45, 7. So this array has 5 elements. So what I'm going to say, for example, is, and I'll say like let I equal 0. So I'll say while I is less than 5, and we'll make sure to put this in parentheses. Then we'll put in an opening bracket. And this is just going to say, all right, while I is less than 5, we're going to do this. And I'm going to say console.log array1 at the ith position. And then we're going to say I. Unfortunately, we can't do minus minus in JavaScript, no matter how nice it is. So we'll have to do the minus equals 1. And if we go down and run this. Oh, okay. So can you guys?
Sure we can't use minus minus in JavaScript for our.
I'm pretty sure, at least I didn't learn it that we could, but we can always try it.
I think you can, maybe not.
You can do
Pretty sure you can.
plus or minus minus. Yeah.
Okay, in that case, never mind. Turns out you can use it. But so before we do that though, what happened here? Why am I getting a ton of undefineds in my terminal? And if I kept this running, why would that crash my computer?
You made an infinite loop.
Yep. Why did the infinite loop happen though?
I is always less than 5.
Okay, good. So while I is less than 5, the value of I is always decreasing. So if I just keeps going down, it's never gonna, this is always gonna be true. It's never gonna break out. So because of that, it's just gonna keep on printing stuff. And obviously we can't print negative values. So if I change this to a plus equals, or just I plus plus, and we rerun it, it works as intended. But I'm glad that you guys caught that, because this was our first example of group debugging, and we will be doing a lot more of this in the coming weeks. So this is, again, the general way that a while statement works is it keeps, every time it runs through, it says, is this condition true? While it's true, we do keep doing it. Once it becomes false, we stop doing it. Now, the second thing that we can do is a for loop. We can say for, and now we have to say another let. We have to say let, let's call it I equals 0, I less than 10, and then I plus plus. So this will basically say, we're going to run this 10 times, because that starts this outer boundary, right, the start point, the end point, and then how much we're incrementing by. And then we'll just say like console.log I. And if we run this, and if all goes well, we get the numbers from 0 through 9, and it runs this 10 times. So that's the way that using a for loop works. It's, again, essentially the same principle. We can also change this from, let's say we don't want it to iterate by 1s. Let's say we want it to iterate by 2s instead. So it'll go 0, 2, 4, 8. Well, we just change this guy from the plus plus to the plus equals 2. We run it, and then it skips every second number. So that's the main way that we get a for loop. And that's about it for the JavaScript 101. Does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff that I just briefed through before we get to problems?
Yes, I have 2 questions. When we were doing
Please.
arrays and you use methods, I know some methods actually modify the array, but some actually return a new array.
Mhm.
And is that something we just intuitively know, or we just memorize which ones do, create a new
One
array?
of the cardinal rules of programming, in my opinion, don't memorize things when you have documentation for it. So, because again, documentation is your friend and it is there to help. This isn't like a proctored school exam where you can't look up anything. Trust me, programmers look stuff up all the time. And in different languages, the tools do different things too. So for example, if let's say I say let or const, I don't know, say array 1, and I'll just say 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll do const array 2 is going to be 5, 6, 7, 8. So there are some methods do modify the arrays and some don't. So if I were to say something like console.log array1.concat, which is that tool that we used last time, and we're going to basically add together array 1 and array 2. But now I want to double check if this changed the value of array 1. I'm going to console.log array 1 after. Now, if I run this, we see that it concatenates 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7, 8. But array 1 is still the same. It doesn't change it at all. It still keeps it as 1, 2, 3, 4. But now, let's say that I want to change it so that array 1 is, I fill the whole thing up with 0 values. So array 1.fill with zeros. If I run that, we see that the fill command does change the value of array 1 when we run, even if we don't automatically tell it to. So some array methods will change the value of the array inherently. Some others, like concat, won't. And the easiest way to tell which ones do and which ones don't, go to the documentation and see what the documentation says. It's the most surefire way to do that. And also, as you just use the array tools more, you'll gradually end up memorizing them anyway, just by use and by habit. So don't stress out about memorizing anything now. It'll all come as time goes on. Hopefully that's a helpful answer.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. Especially that I don't have to memorize. That's the great part.
Indeed it is. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions about any of the fundamental stuff behind JavaScript?
I have a question. You said we can always look up, but I'm wondering during the interview, you cannot look it up, right?
Okay, that's true. I've heard that some introducers will let you, but you probably shouldn't be looking up really simple things. But again, that's a little bit of a ways off. So again, don't for the most 90% of the time when you're coding on the job, or if you're coding here, you don't have to look things up. It's only for like the really rare or special cases, like certain interviews, for example, where they just, or like some hackathons where they will say you cannot look anything up. But otherwise, 99% of the time, you'll be allowed to look stuff up, and it'll be encouraged to.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so we're gonna take, let's say, a break until 7:50, and we'll come back at 7:50, and we're gonna work on an exercise together as a group, because I'd like us to do that just once before we go into doing the exercises for tonight. So I will see all of you in just about 4 minutes.